The GTX 680, a flagship that is now a decade old. With 1536 CUDA cores and a core clock speed of over 1 GHz. This card used to be quite the beast, but now, 10 years later, how does it hold up in a suite of modern and games that would have been out around the same time? With a graphics score of 7640, this puts the GTX 680 on par with the 1050 Ti. Because most PCs this would be installed in would have slower DDR3 RAM, I decided not to go over the 2 gigabytes of memory. As you can see, at normal settings, the game runs pretty efficiently even on a high refresh rate monitor, hitting an average of 125 and never dropping below 60 FPS. This means that if you wanted to, you could lock it to 60 with VSync and you never even notice it drop. You could bump the settings up to high or very high and most likely not experience any frame dips in excess of 60 or at the very least 30. The next game is BioShock Infinite. I picked this because it would have been out just a year after the GTX 680 launched, and it's free on the Epic Store right now for anybody to grab. I ran the game at 1440p because the GTX 680 would have been able to run it at that resolution back when it came out. You could lower it to 1080p high or very high and experience a much smoother gameplay mechanic. When the gunplay came in, the frame rate did drop, so it's possible that lowering the resolution could help with that issue. The game did drop as low as 10 FPS for the 0.1% low, so I would recommend dropping the resolution to 1080p to play this game. I assume that the 2 GB memory limitation is impacting it, but it is also possible that the card just really isn't made to run this game at 1440p. It is a resolution that was not being targeted nearly as much when the 680 came out. The next game is the classic Fortnite. This game is such a popular competitive shooter, there's no way I couldn't include it in this benchmark. The GTX 680 might not be getting driver updates anymore, but it can still pump out nearly 100 FPS in this fast-paced game with low settings and the epic render distance. There were a few frame dips shortly after landing, but it could just be that the game is not enjoying where it is installed on my computer. It might have nothing to do with the GTX 680. I know that dropping does lead to frame drops occasionally, as well as gunfire and explosions. So it's possible that you won't experience these drops with the 680. It's also possible that it's just a driver issue and, it's not getting driver updates anymore. But I'm sure some third-party people will start to work on it just like they did with the AMD cards. Next up is Rocket League. This game is a competitive, fast-paced car soccer game. I bumped the resolution up to 1440p high, and I did experience some frame drops, so I would recommend playing this game at 1080p on a high refresh rate panel, and you shouldn't have any issues whatsoever. This game will absolutely run smoothly on even an worse or older card than the GTX 680. I chose Valorant as the shooter instead of Counter-Strike because Counter-Strike did not appreciate MSI Afterburner. Valorant ran extremely well. I do believe this game is majorly CPU bound, and my 5800X definitely helped push it to 450 FPS. The frame drops were probably due to the 680's age or lack of driver updates, but the game ran essentially flawlessly, and you wouldn't notice any frame drops on a 60Hz monitor. It would be perfect for a high refresh rate 144Hz monitor at 1080p, and you would notice some drops, but not too many. It should not be an issue. The next few games are anime games, and I chose these because most people don't run benchmarks on games like this. Dragon Ball Z Kakarot at 1080p high with FXAA ran average 60 FPS, which is the cap that I set, and it did drop below 60, but if you just lower the settings a little bit, it should stay above 30 FPS, and with VSync enabled, it should be a great experience. The next anime game I chose is Atelier Ryza. Now, this is a relatively new Atelier game, and it did have some issues running on the GTX 680. At 1080p middle settings, it only averaged 46 FPS and did drop to as low as 11. I would say dropping the settings to low would help create a more smooth gaming experience, but considering it's a turn-based JRPG, you could run it at 30 FPS without too many issues. I don't think it's a distracting problem to have it drop to 11. Dragon Quest XI is a game you can no longer buy on Steam. You can only buy the Definitive Edition, but this was the version that I had. The Definitive Edition should actually be easier to run because it's a port from the Switch game. Ran this at 1080p low settings, averaged 54 FPS. I did see some large frame drops to 3 FPS when I attacked the enemy for the first time in battle, like when I booted the game. It was not really a problem after that. If possible, you could lower the settings even more. I had the settings all at 1. They do go to 0 or none, and that would probably smooth it out to an even 60 FPS with less frame drops. The Definitive Edition of the game will also likely run even better on the GTX 680. The last anime game is a personal favorite of mine. I love the Tales series, and Tales of Arise was a great game that I sunk over 70 hours into. I ran it at 1080p high settings with TAA. It did only average 40 FPS and did have some frame drops down to the single digits. However, you could lower the settings to 1080p low, and I suspect that it should run around 60 FPS. Dropping the resolution or the settings should allow you to play the game, much closer to 60 FPS, which would be ideal for an action RPG like this. Next up, I chose some much harder to run games. These are newer, difficult to run games even for some modern hardware. Cyberpunk 2077 absolutely destroys the GTX 680. At 1080p lowest settings with medium textures, it couldn't even hit 30. Now, I could lower the resolution down to 720p, but the game looks like a blur. It's just not fun to experience like that. I would recommend either trying to get a newer graphics card or waiting for Fidelity Super Resolution 2.0 to come out on this game. It looks really promising in Deathloop, and when it comes to Cyberpunk, it should be able to bump up the frame rate above 30, which should be playable, and it won't look like absolute smear all over a window. The last game is Elden Ring. Now, this game actually doesn't support DirectX 11 cards, so I had to go into the files and manipulate some of them and change them in order to get the game to launch on the GTX 680. And unfortunately, this means you won't be able to play online if you plan on using this card. I would definitely recommend against using the GTX 680 to play Elden Ring. It barely managed a 30 FPS average. It did drop down to the 20s. It was stuttery. There was micro stutter, I think due to the lack of driver optimization, since the game is much newer than the last drivers that actually came out for the GTX 680. I would say if you could, get a more modern card in a similar price range, maybe a 1050. The 1050 Ti is similar in pure performance numbers, but it should actually beat it in a game like this, considering the driver support is actually there. I love Elden Ring, but if you want to play online or at 1080p, you really should invest in a different card. That's about it for the GTX 680. I managed to get my hands on this WindForce model for just $85, which compared to a 1050 Ti is a little cheaper, and it's a similar performance in terms of pure metrics. The 3D Mark Firestrike score was very similar. But in games, I imagine if it doesn't have the driver support, it's actually going to perform worse than the 1050 Ti. And it sucks down a lot more power. It uses an 8-pin and a 6-pin connector, pulls over 200 watts. You can overclock it, that would make it pull even more. If electricity costs are high in your area, I can't recommend this card over something like a 1050 Ti. If you liked the video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. I will be doing a video on some other graphics cards that I managed to pick up from a nearby thrift store, so stay tuned for those. Leave a comment down below about the GTX 680 if you've ever had one, or any of your thoughts on it.